Hi all, and this is an educational discussion, kind of introduction to Celo, and I'm super excited to have our speakers today because we're going to talk about Celo and also look at one of the use cases of Celo. So we have Head of Strategy and Innovation, Nikhil, and CEO and co-founder of EthicHub, Jori. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves and maybe talk a little bit more about what you do and why?
Sure, I can go first, and then Jori, I'll hand it over to you. So, hey everyone, Nikhil from the Celo Foundation. I head strategy and innovation. And so my team primarily focuses on supporting the launch of different projects on the Celo ecosystem. And so that ranges from DeFi projects to on-ramps and off-ramps, NFTs, as well as social impact use cases. And the other piece we really work on is exploring new use cases and helping kind of build those out. So for example, we've done different pilots with different nonprofit entities such as Mercy Corps, Grameen, the World Food Program, things like that. And we get to work with some really cool partners in the Celo ecosystem. The other piece I think that's really important to flag is for Celo, the big emphasis is around building regenerative economies and regenerative finance. And so that is a mix of kind of community commerce, kind of social impact use cases, payments, as well as DeFi, so things such as what Jori and EthicHub are doing, and lastly, and just as importantly, climate solutions as well. But on that note, I'll hand it over to Jori.
Thank you, Nikhil and Maya. I'm very happy to be here with you in Celo, which is our house in EthicHub. Now, since July, we launched in Celo. And we are very happy that we finally find the house for the intersection of crypto and impact that is what we are doing since 2017. In EthicHub, we are a lending protocol with focus on smallholder farmers in developing economies. And it was very hard at the beginning because it was like in one side it was the impact and in the other side the crypto space. And it was like oil and water, very hard to blend together until we found ReFi. And specifically within ReFi, I think the core where it is being more developed and more focused on is in Celo ecosystem. And that's why we are now with focus on Celo.
Amazing. And you touched on so many points. I want to dig deeper in a little bit, but just before that, one thing I'm always curious about when I talk to people in Web3 space, especially in the ReFi space, is their background, the story of how they came to be in this Web3 impact. Can you talk a little bit more about what you did before being at Celo and EthicHub? How did you get into Web3? What drew you to Web3 and ReFi specifically, maybe?
Jori, do you want to start this one first?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so in 2016, before wholesaler in Spain with, I don't know, more than 100 sales points. And
hey, just want to check. I can't hear, but maybe others can.
Yeah, Jori's breaking up for me a little bit too.
Before you hear me better?
Yeah, now it's working. But it was working for a second and then it went away. So hopefully you're able to speak, but I'll flag it if
the problem,
if we're not able to.
I am in Mexico with our farmers, so sometimes the connections is very challenging to have a stable connection over here. So let me know if I have again a problem. I was telling that before EthicHub, I was doing something very different in wholesaling. Managing a wholesaler in Spain. I am half Mexican, half Spanish. And in Mexico, my family have a coffee farm. I have lived there also for quite many years and managed that coffee farm too. And in 2016, I decided I wanted to start something. And I did an innovation degree where I met blockchain technology. And for me, it was like love at first sight. I saw a lot of potential on this, and I commit myself to build on 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 leveraging on blockchain, on crypto. And it was like, okay, but I want to do something purposeful that I feel um like I am doing something for a better world, etc. And I learned also in that year about SDGs and all the problems around the world. And the problem I feel more close to myself is like the unbanked people, because in Mexico the small farmers I know, uh, they are this profile. No, the when we talk about the unbanked, who are the unbanked? The unbanked are mostly smallholder farmers in developing economies, and there are more than 1 billion of this kind. So I always say that for me, this is the blue ocean opportunity for crypto, not to fight the banks and the traditional financial system, but improving it so it can reach the base of the pyramid that the traditional financial system couldn't reach. And more or less, this is how it all started. And that's why we also also connecting these farmers with developing economies is because myself is ourselves, my wife and co-founder Gabriela, she's also half Mexican, half Chinese. So we feel like we are kind of a bridge to connect these two worlds. And the easiest way to connect these worlds is to transfer money from developing economies to developed ones and vice versa. So you the super much higher than in developed ones, even though the in some countries like in Mexico and Brazil, the forex is the valuation. It doesn't. It is not that hard that it can explain not a quarter of the interest rates that especially these kind of borrowers have to pay. Our farmers are used to pay even over 100% interest rates, just for you to imagine.
Yeah, that's a great story, Jori, and it's really cool how personal it is for you, and it really explains why you're so passionate about your work. How about you, Nikhil? What's your background? What was your life like pre Web3?
Yeah, sure. I think Jori has a much more interesting story than me, but on my end, it was how I first got interested in crypto was and Web3 was the time, obviously not Web3, was around kind of financial inclusion as well. But my interest was particularly around how you can bypass traditional institutions that have historically not kind of been interested or not really financially feasible for them to support financial inclusion. And so for me, it really came from a racial justice, racial equity background in the US. I've spent some time kind of working on some of those core issues, as well as kind of working with some financial inclusion organizations. And so that was really how it started for me. And actually, my first kind of first foray into the space was outside of kind of looking at Ethereum and Bitcoin, was actually looking at Celo. This was back in 2019 when Celo was kind of really honing in on that. The emphasis was on thinking about how to create a mobile architecture focused in emerging markets, as well as at the time it was also thinking about the US as well. And how you can design a better system, one that was also very easy to use, because Bitcoin and Ethereum weren't very easy to use. And so that was really what got me interested. My background, yeah, as I mentioned, was in economic consulting, nonprofit management, and then spent a little bit of time in management consulting as well. But really, what I saw was the opportunity to build a completely new tech stack, a completely new layer for finance, for human empowerment. And that's what I've been really excited working on so far.
Really cool. And kind of going off of that, I'm curious, how is your background in traditional sector um, helped you in the Web3, and how is it different or similar working in kind of a more traditional sector versus in the Web3 space?
I think there's a ton of overlap, actually. As much as we'd like to say that there isn't, and that we're reinventing it, that we're kind of changing everything, but I think there's actually a ton of overlap. So the first piece is thinking about financial inclusion. There's a lot of community organizations that already spend a lot of efforts, and nonprofits that spend a lot of time and energy working on financial inclusion. So from that standpoint, a lot of these kind of principles can actually apply here. So if we're thinking about community commerce and community-based finance, there's a rich history of organizations and communities around the world that have been doing this. So it's not like we're creating something brand new that's never been thought of. What we can actually do is we can create the tech stack that actually allows it for it to be much easier and much more scalable. Um, that's particularly the case in historically marginalized communities. And then in terms of kind of understanding some of the other pieces from more traditional Web 2 entities, finance and economics are still really relevant, especially when you're thinking about token models and how to make sure you're thinking about the actual kind of transaction costs that might be your gas fees and ease of access and things along those lines. It's quite similar to the way that other entities have had to thought about it, or those core questions. The difference, of course, is we're able to use different technology. And so there's actually a ton of learnings from there as well, from like a user experience standpoint. A lot of organizations do pilots, both private sector and public sector, and that involves kind of design thinking principles. Those are, again, things that we can use in Web3. And I'm sure Jori and EthicHub have done a lot of this as well. So I think it's a lot of those kinds of pieces. The other one as well is partnerships. So like if you are doing lending in real world, what you'll have to do is that you'll have to actually think about how to accumulate capital for that. And so it's a mix of both Web3 users who are already just looking for yield, but it's probably also looking for traditional financial institutions and fintech lenders, because that's how you draw capital. And really the value of crypto is that you can get capital from anywhere. So similarly, now you have a business development platform to be able to go to any institution or any person anywhere around the world, which was tricky before. And so I think a lot of those same kind of principles, especially from a go-to-market standpoint, can still apply here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can I so I want to add something that is okay. I do agree that it has a lot of similarities in many ways, but at the same time, it even is contra is negative in some way, in some ways. Just to point something is like the decentralization, the DAO stack. No, it's a totally different mindset from traditional corporations and traditional governance and traditional way of doing things. No, and also crypto incentives and tokenomics at the end doesn't have much to learnings from before. It's something completely new. So whatever you did before, it was not very useful for these kind of things. All the rest, for sure, is very helpful. Having a lot of experience before.
Yeah, agreed on that. There's some overlap, but then there's also pieces that are dramatically different. And so it does require someone to understand those new pieces, especially the things that haven't been there before, and really make sure you understand that. Like I think like DAO governance is an excellent example where I've seen a lot of folks from traditional backgrounds really struggle with navigating that and understanding how to operate when or like decisions are made through a DAO model. And there's essentially that type of governance piece. So 100% agreed on that. Thanks for flagging. The other piece I want to mention too is similarly for climate solutions is that the challenge historically has again been for climate types of pieces that there was a lot of social organizing and movements, but it still required kind of centralized institutions to kind of operate it the way they do. But if we look now, there are a lot of different ways of kind of thinking about climate-based solutions, and how Web3 gives you a completely different toolkit and a completely different approach to actually solve those in a way that might actually be quite powerful.
That was a perfect segue to the next point I wanted to talk about a little bit is, taking a step back and thinking of the big picture. And you both already mentioned ReFi. And I'm so excited to actually bring both of you here in our Impact series, because previously, when we chatted with Regen Network, we've mostly focused, on actually climate change mitigation. But then I'm curious what ReFi is for you, and how would you expand the meaning of ReFi beyond kind of just climate focused work, especially with the example of EthicHub. So yeah, what is ReFi for you, and how does Celo and EthicHub add to this growing community? In what ways?
Yeah, so for me, ReFi still is something to be defined. Same way at the beginning, it was a lot of discussions about what was DeFi, no? And today it's more clear. It takes time to give a clear common definition to things. And at the beginning, ReFi was, as you said, a lot of about climate change solutions, but the problems in the world are is not only climate change. There are a lot of problems, and regeneration is not only environmental; it's also social. And at the end, I think today most of the people agree that ReFi is about solving both environmental problems, social problems. And one way of thinking for me is like this is the intersection of crypto and impact. And in impact space, in traditional finance, it's a lot of experience already, no? And we can leverage on huge pools of capital in the impact space. We are talking is over $1 trillion in under management in the traditional impact space that we can target if we some way leverage on what they understand is impact, how they measure impact, etc. No? So one way to do that is to speak about SDGs. What is the biggest problems in the world? Is SDGs. We can agree that it's not perfect. And some people, I know some people working on the regenerative sustainable development goals instead of sustainable development goals. But until we have that new framework, we can just use the traditional one, the sustainable development goals. This is the what it means impact if you are contributing to these problems, and that is ReFi if you are leveraging on crypto to solve that problems.
Yeah, similar to Jori, and thanks, Ria. That was really, really helpful. So the way I've thought about it is kind of ReFi fits in as broader piece around building a regenerative economy. And so a regenerative economy here can include climate. That's one very key vertical. But then it goes to a lot more beyond that. And I actually think you're kind of framing it within the Sustainable Development Goals is a really, really good framework for that, and one that a lot of people are familiar with. Because it's not just climate, right? It's also about human prosperity and well-being. And so that is kind of these other pieces around how do you make sure people have access to capital where they may not have it? How can they kind of address their health and take care of the ones that they love? And so I think it's actually thinking about an economy that's really designed for that. Because historically, if you think of the model around capitalism, at its worst is not at all interested in that. And perhaps at its best is theoretically meant to solve that. But historically, we've seen that that's not the case. And so for ReFi and building a regenerative economy, it's actually a chance to say, hey, there's a new way of building an economy, one that is putting climate at the center, one that's allowing for shared economies and shared resources, one that's allowing for like ownership by people rather than kind of ownership by centralized institutions that are really interested in taking some type of transaction cost or collecting data or something along those lines. And the way I've kind of thought about it from a DeFi angle on my end is kind of a few core verticals. So one is having more localized currencies rather than relying on the dollar for everything. A second piece is on community focused finance. The third vertical is on universal basic income. And then, of course, the last vertical on that I've kind of thought about it is climate.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, both of you. I love the SDG focus, and I like, Nikhil, that you mentioned, the impacts of a sort of the global capitalism that we talk a lot about in grad school, and I feel like that's not often mentioned in the Web3 space. So I think it's important to acknowledge all these adverse effects of the system that we live in. Yeah, it's so cool and inspiring. And kind of now within this bigger ReFi framework, I'm curious to jump more in depth about your organizations. And I guess it would make more sense to start with Celo, just because the infrastructure for the EthicHub. So Nikhil, can you talk a little bit about sort of a brief overview? What is Celo? Like, how would you define it? In an easy way? What are some of your goals and how you achieve them? Maybe talk a little bit about, the structure of the organization and the people who are involved. And then it would be great to hear from Jori about how EthicHub came to be and how this collaboration even happened with Celo.
Sure. So I work at the Celo Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that supports the development of the Celo blockchain. And the Celo blockchain is a layer 1 blockchain with an ecosystem of global partners and Web3 applications that are really focusing on building a more inclusive financial system. And so the core design features of the Celo blockchain are kind of this mobile first architecture and kind of designing a way in which nodes are incentivized to service ultralight clients, and those ultralight clients being mobile phones. The second piece is around a decentralized mapping structure for phone numbers. So how can you basically connect your phone number to an account address and having that in a decentralized manner rather than a centralized manner. Another really core pillar to that from a technical standpoint has been a ZK ultralight sync, in which you're able to have your phone be able to access or the actual data transfer, and the data that's required can actually be less. So you're able to kind of operate in lower bandwidth areas than what you might otherwise be able to based off of kind of how the actual infrastructure is built. A few other pieces are kind of an emphasis on, we have different stable coins, and then the gas fees on the Celo blockchain can be paid by those stable coins. So normally if we think of how to kind of make a transaction on something that's on a blockchain, you'd have to hold both the native token for gas fees as well as something like USDC. But on the Celo blockchain, you're able to use one of the stable coins called CUSD and be able to pay for gas fees directly with that. So it can make an overall user experience much easier. And then the other really core piece has been an emphasis on emerging markets and having kind of a localized presence there and really building out an ecosystem of projects that are really honing in on those core issues. So EthicHub being like an excellent example in my mind of a group that's saying, hey, like there's something that needs to be done here as it relates to kind of DeFi and getting capital to people who don't normally have access to it, and going out and doing that type of work. So it's kind of that ecosystem around it. So that's generally speaking what Celo is. It's also, I should also note, we're an EVM compatible chain. So we believe in a multi-chain thesis. So how do you make sure that you're actually bridging with other chains and creating kind of an overall ecosystem in which there's core purposes for why someone would be on the Celo blockchain, and making sure that they're able to kind of also be able to access other blockchains, as well as people from other blockchains can access the Celo blockchain.
Yeah, and from the EthicHub standpoint, why we moved to Celo, and I think is in one side because most of the things Nikhil has said is, for example, this focus on mobile first. Until now, we couldn't find a solution for our farmers to interact with the technology, so we are leveraging on intermediaries. But our vision is to be able to interact directly with the farmers, so they receive the money and they cash in, cash out in local shops or whatever. And the only blockchain that has a clear focus on significant that Celo, instead of giving grants to bring Aave or whatever, no, DeFi, huge DeFi protocols to bring total value lock to the blockchain, instead of that is giving grants to people building bridges to the real world, which is what we need at the hub in order to accomplish that vision, that the farmers interact directly with the technology and with the lenders, providing them with working capital and warranties for the loans. And I think this focus not only in connecting with the real world, but also on impact and diversity and developing economies. No other blockchain has that focus. And I think also it was very significant that during Celo Connect in Barcelona, and that's the first time I went to a crypto event, and I have been in many, that most of the people were very diverse. Many people from Africa, from Latin America, from Southeast Asia. The majority of the people, it was not the Europeans or Americans, as it tend to be in other crypto events, because of this focus on giving grants and helping these people to build on Celo ecosystem.
Yeah, Celo hosts some really good events. I have to mention, really cool all over the world, actually. Um, and kind of going off of what both of you said about this collaboration, can you talk more about the process? So, how does it look like to build on Celo, like from the EthicHub perspective? Like, so you picked Celo for these reasons, for all these features that the ecosystem provides. So what's next? Like, how much support do you get from the Celo Foundation? Like, how much autonomy do you have? Is this like a long-term partnership where you're essentially are not really participating in each other's business much? Like, how does that collaboration look like?
So for sure, you have independence because we are different project building on Celo, no? But I have to say that it is very supporting working with Celo. It's not only that we had a grant to build liquidity there for now. I hope we have a grant more for development. But Nikhil and others within the Celo ecosystem have been very supportive on this other side of the business that Nikhil was mentioning before, that is doing partnerships, connections with potential partners, etc. No? And I think that's very key that Celo also have this support for the projects building on Celo. I understand also in the technical side, but in the technical side we have a super top team, so we didn't need that kind of support. But from my experience, personal experience, it was a very supportive community.
And going off of the partnership point, I'm actually curious to understand better, Nikhil, if you can clarify what's what are some of the different partners you work with? Because I know you have Alliance for Prosperity. So how do you select who is on that alliance? And also, these are not the only partners you work with, right? Can you maybe distinguish between the different sets of partners you have and how you collaborate with them?
Sure. So first, with the Alliance for Prosperity, those are going to be organizations that can be Web2 organizations or even some Web3 that may not be necessarily live on Celo. but we're collaborating with to build something out, or we're working across our ecosystem to support different use cases. So an example of that might be Kickstarter, who's a member of the Alliance for Prosperity. So for Kickstarter, it's actually kind of Kickstarter's working on building out basically a crowdfunding platform on the Celo blockchain. So we partnered with them to support that. Another one would be Deutsche Telekom that we've been working with to kind of build out some mobile pieces with. So those are some examples of Alliance for Prosperity, but I think it goes beyond that. I think we have an ecosystem of partners who we do pilots to really explore new use cases. So earlier I had mentioned some of them, but those are Mercy Corps Ventures, for example, the World Food Program, Grameen, Care International. And so I think we've also built out an ecosystem of partners in which we can actually go and test out some of these use cases. So we can go and do that field work. So that's from the Alliance for Prosperity perspective. But then it's also thinking about, for different projects in the Celo ecosystem, how are we connecting the dots and helping founders and developers and builders kind of then work with other partners across the Web3 space on Celo. And so oftentimes for me, it's like kind of pinging a message over to a project saying, hey, have you guys actually chatted with this other group? They're doing stuff that you're probably really interested in, and they might actually be able to inform some of your thinking around it. So trying to create an ecosystem around that and helping kind of build more of those pieces out. Basically trying to just help builders connect the dots, because obviously they're super busy on the things that they're working on. And then I think the other piece for us has been kind of also providing some of the internal support itself, in terms of, we've been thinking a lot about how can we help kind of use our ability and basically find new partners and help kind of identify new partners for the Celo ecosystem. And so one example here is that we did recently was Uniswap. So a number of climate-related projects were actually like, hey, we would want to have Uniswap v3 on Celo, specifically for concentrated liquidity. So this was something that we hadn't exactly tracked, but it was the ecosystem that was like, hey, we would want to have Uniswap v3. And so then I basically went and kind of worked on that, which was putting together the governance proposal, engaging with the Uniswap community, and basically looking to have Uniswap v3 deployed on Celo. And then from there, really kind of building up a relationship with the Uniswap Foundation, which just launched. And so it's kind of a full mix of different pieces, but both across Web 2 as well as Web 3, and kind of really aiming for supporting real world use cases.
Yeah, really cool. And kind of going off of that, real world use cases, and you mentioned field work. The big question I usually have for impact projects, especially Web3 space like this, you have the great technological infrastructure and all these capabilities that the layer one blockchain that's connected to the phones allows. But how do you ensure that there is actual impact on the ground? And I think EthicHub could be a great example for it. How do you ensure there's actual help for the small farmer? And can you maybe, Jori, talk a little bit about the use of local nodes? How do you apply that model?
Yeah, I think impact measurement is one super challenging thing, both in crypto and in traditional impact space. And there is a lot of greenwashing because you can just say this is impact, and I measure this, and you do a lot of this, but is that really impact? Is very hard to measure impact. So I think from our standpoint, the clearest point how to measure the impact we are doing with the farmers is, in one side, providing with much more affordable working capital that they had before. So on the more money lent, the more impact. Then second is the focus on what they use the money for. We never ever give in their harvest, in their etc. So we make sure the money is invested into improving productivity, so that increase in productivity pay for the interest and more, and this more is the impact. And third is we also help the farmers sell their crops afterward. Is given back. to the farmers. So that is also very easy to measure as impact. But impact measurement is very difficult, and within the mission and values of the company slash DAO. If you call yourself EthicHub, this forces you, not only you, but all the people collaborating and interacting with EthicHub, to think this is ethical or it isn't. I think that's very important, and it's also a declaration of intentions to call yourself that way, because this is like a high responsibility, not to do impact afterwards, because that kill the project if you are just cheating on doing some green or social washing. And I think a bit that's it. Sorry.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And Nikhil, how do you approach impact measurement from the foundation level?
Yeah, very similar to what Jori mentioned. And a lot of it is kind of, I think there is a concern around greenwashing and this idea of kind of folks saying they're doing social impact, but it's really kind of digging into the details and saying, what is that? So we actually, one thing I want to note is we'll actually have a theory of change report that we'll be publishing in the next month or so, which really hones in on what are those core, what are core metrics that we should be thinking about when we think about impact and Web3. And so part of it is actually doing a lot of kind of that education piece. But when we think of impact, I think it's very similar to how EthicHub thinks about it. It is actual lives reach. It's not necessarily just purely TVL or something like even like active users. I think we've historically thought that, if you go on DApp Radar and look at something like monthly active users, the real question is what is a purpose of those of that count? Like, who is it reaching, and what is the actual kind of use case there? So in the case of EthicHub, it would be something like kind of the number of farmers who are supported and the amount of loans that are basically able to be delivered to farmers. Other projects like, for example, Impact Market, which is a universal basic income project on Celo. How many kind of recipients are there, and how much money are they getting on a daily basis or a weekly basis based off of the structure? Good ghosting is another example where it's how much money are people actually getting saved, because it's basically a project that does gamified savings. And so how, like, actually in terms of the volume of people, how many people are reached and how much money are they actually saving? So I think it's thinking about kind of those types of metrics. And in the past, it's also been some of our pilots where it's saying, what is the change in outcome for the end person, right? So how is it that they are better off than they were before? And if they aren't, then we should probably flag that and say, this isn't actually doing anything better. It's kind of just doing what's already there. So thinking about that actual difference and the differential of that and saying, what is the new status quo? And is that something that's better or worse based off of what's being offered? And this totally varies across the different project and the different use case.
That's a really cool way of looking at impact measurement. I like how you put it, and I look forward to reading the report. Actually, it sounds awesome. And kind of going off of the challenges of measuring impact and the various metrics, what are some other big challenges that you see for your organization, and maybe also some criticisms, and how do you address those challenges and or criticisms?
Jori, I see you're unmuted, but I don't know if there is an audio issue on your end.
Now you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
So going back to the impact measurement, which is one of the challenges for sure, one of the biggest ones, theory of change is very important, and also a way of doing impact measurement for us, I forgot to say, is randomized trial controls and of how are the farmers the day we start working with them, and how are they 10 years later or 3 years later or whatever. No? That's the most reliable way to provide clear insight about the impact. And other challenges for us tend to think is used to these traditional DeFi protocols fully or 10 billions even, so or 40 billions and collapse afterwards. And more you target the base of the pyramid, the harder it is to reach them. So
Hey, Jori, you're cutting out quite a bit right now.
I'm sorry, but I was just finishing with this scalability problem and also the trust. It's hard to trust something connecting to the real world when you are interacting. Even institutions start lending to our farmers. But building that trust, it took us years and years. So I would say that scalability, impact measurement, and
these are really interesting points. Unfortunately, you cut out in some of them, but yeah, I heard impact, scalability, impact measurement, scalability, and trust. Those are big ones. How about you, Nikhil? What are some challenges you're facing as the organization?
Yeah, so a few things. One is I think there's still a need for more projects like EthicHub that you've always been speaking on to actually go and do exactly what he just said. I think there's generally if you look at kind of the ecosystem of Web3, most projects are still just kind of primarily just building a protocol and calling it a day. And oftentimes, I mean, that can be successful as it relates to kind of tapping into existing Web3 users or people who are very tech savvy. But for the large volume of people where kind of groups like EthicHub are really focusing on, they're actually not. It actually doesn't work that well. So take something like Curve, right, which has some of the highest number of like daily users. I would never have my parents use Curve. I use it a lot, but I would never have my parents do it because it's not easy to use. It's not easy to understand, and I think that it's a great infrastructure layer, but I think it allows for things that then you can go out and do in the real world. So I think there's a need for more of those types of pieces. I think the second piece is there's always kind of a challenge around liquidity, and so ensuring that there's sufficient liquidity for those use cases. And I think like it's obviously been a little bit more challenging with the down market as well as how do you make sure there's sufficient liquidity driving through the ecosystem to be able to support those end use cases that we're really honing in on. And then I think another kind of challenge has been, I think, being good and upfront on like what are the things that we're really focusing on across Web3. So I think there has been instances where it's like, I think different projects have said, oh, we're promising a yield of some sort, but it may not be sustainable. And I think us as kind of people in Web3 need to be really, really good at pointing out like what is sustainable, what isn't. And it's sustainable in the sense that it can't be subsidized and saying, oh, it'll be subsidized until it gets sorted out. But we can't market that, right? Saying that it is sustainable in perpetuity, it's probably not. And so I think really understanding what are those things that actually that will continue to last, and what are things that might be temporary based off of kind of initial token rewards or things along those lines. So I think there's kind of a need for that. And I think the last like big challenge, I think, and everyone's really going to be facing this, is from a regulatory standpoint, both in the US as well as other countries, and what is kind of considered to be possible from a regulatory standpoint and what isn't. I think there's still a lot of kind of clarity that we need there, and I think we're actually seeing a lot more kind of pushback from various governments, which can be both good and bad. Good in the sense that it kind of forces the industry to make sure that things are robust and don't harm people, but then it can also sometimes be a challenge because of course things might be misunderstood or misconstrued. So those are what I would say are kind of some of the core challenges that I've seen from the Celo Foundation that we really had to think about.
That's a great overview. Yeah, and we're living through this uncertainty in regulation right now. curious what's going to come out of it. Yeah, and as we were concluding in the hour, the last point I wanted to bring up is, at BAF, we are a student-focused group, and we want the Web3 community to grow. What can you recommend to students, young leaders who want to be involved in the Web3 impact space and ReFi, and how can they get more involved? What would be your message for them?
Jori, you should take this one first. I think you'll have a really good answer for this.
I'm not sure because I missed part of the question, but regarding what I would recommend. At first, I always recommend people to start looking to themselves, to what you are, who you are, what you are good at doing life in your life, and now that you decided that you really this is part of your life, I would start studying for sure, and if you want to focus on impact, ReFi DAO, which is like they have like these ReFi protocols, etc. And I'm pretty sure in Celo you have a lot of education. But I'm not sure if that the answer you were expecting, Nikhil, because I didn't hear the full question.
Yeah, I was actually thinking something along those lines, Jori, as well. But yeah, I can kind of close that out. Is agreed. I think Yori's right in terms of identifying different projects that are working at those spaces that you're interested in and reaching out. I think a lot of them are super interested in people, are always looking for people who are really passionate about these types of core issues. And so reaching out to those projects, I think understanding that kind of ecosystem and looking at and figuring out what are those verticals that you're really interested in. And I think the other piece that's important to keep in mind for students and others is that this takes a good bit of work. I think what EthicHub is doing, having to build trust in community like farming communities, that's a lot of work. That's not just building a protocol. It involves, as we've all noted, right? Yori's out in Mexico without great internet, which suggests that he's in a pretty rural part, and so that requires a lot more work to actually go and kind of do those pieces. And so I think having the kind of being ready for that and really actually understanding those core issues, taking the time to understand them. But I think that's absolutely mission critical for us to actually survive as a species for not even, I don't even think it's a long term. I think it's something that is much more immediate than we're truly realizing. So I think that's what I would encourage students and others. And of course, reaching out. I think from my end, I'm always on Twitter. We have different mechanisms of reaching out to the Celo ecosystem, whether that's through Discord, through Twitter, through the Celo forum, and I think those are some of the core ways. But I think always for anyone who's interested to reach out.
Thank you for such great advice. And oh my gosh, I wish we had another extra hour to chat about, because there's so many things I would love to bring up and learn about what you're doing. But I know we're at the end of the hour, and I just want to thank you, Jori and Nikhil, for taking the time to come talk with us and share your perspective, your knowledge. And I'm really fascinated by all the work that's being done in the ReFi space. And like Nikhil, you mentioned all the hard work that's being done, not just in the office or at home, but also going out there in the field and establishing those connections on the ground. It's really inspiring. So I want to thank you for coming, and hoping to maybe have you on some later point to continue this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us. This was great.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting, and looking forward to meet you again sometime soon.